When Octavian defeated Mark Antony, he eliminated the last rival who could dispute his authority over the vast Roman domains. Although he declared that the Republic continued, in reality he replaced it with a system in which a single leader concentrated power. With that reorganization, the Roman Empire was born, which lasted about 500 years in the west and more than 1 millennium in the east. That form of command was called the Principate, because the ruler was considered the princeps, the first among the citizens. In time, the name Caesar, previously just a family surname, came to mean emperor. Even centuries later, the kings of Russia and Germany adopted versions of the same title, Tsar and Kaiser. The weight of those names shows how much the political and cultural influence of Rome endured throughout history. What was the origin and greatness of this empire that marked ancient civilization forever? 63 before Christ. In the year 63 before Christ, Marcus Tullius Cicero was 43 years old and held the highest magistracy of the Republic. He had reached the consulship without coming from a noble family, something that was so uncommon in Rome that it turned him into a symbol of ascent through his own merit. At that time, the city was saturated with debts, with thousands of citizens trapped by interests and economic imbalance. The Senate, divided by internal struggles, could barely contain the discontent that ran through the streets crowded with vendors, beggars, and landless veterans. While the Roman Forum remained the center of political power, social tension was palpable on every corner. It was then that Lucius Sergius Catiline appeared, a member of a respectable but ruined family who gathered a group of followers promising to erase debts and start anew. Cicero had come to power as a defender of the Republican order, and his main task would be to prevent Catiline from breaking that fragile balance. In his speeches before the Senate, later known as In Catilinam, he denounced a conspiracy that, according to him, intended to set fire to the city and assassinate the most influential senators. Rumors spread quickly among the taverns and markets. Rome lived as much on gossip as on laws. The consul convened an extraordinary meeting in the temple of Jupiter Stator, where he delivered his first speech against Catiline. In it, he accused him directly, in front of all the senators, of planning the destruction of Rome. Cicero knew that many doubted his evidence, but he trusted his oratory to convince them. His words, later recorded in public archives, showed the aggressive and calculated style with which he confronted his enemies. "How long, Catiline, will you abuse our patience?" That phrase would become legendary. The accused remained seated, feigning serenity, but his silence confirmed his guilt for many. The next day he left the city for Etruria, where he prepared an armed uprising. Catiline's escape did not resolve the crisis. Several of his accomplices remained in Rome, including Publius Lentulus Sura and Gaius Cethegus, who continued conspiring. Cicero, backed by the Optimates, the conservative faction of the Senate, organized a network of informants who discovered compromising letters. These were presented in a public session and served as definitive proof of treason. The Senate, under the pressure of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, decided to execute the conspirators without a prior trial. That night, Cicero personally supervised the executions in the Tullianum, the state prison. When he returned to the Forum, he announced that the culprits had been eliminated. The people acclaimed him as the savior of the Republic, and Marcus Porcius Cato publicly praised him for his firmness. However, not everyone shared that admiration. In the following years, Gaius Julius Caesar and other leaders began to question the legality of those executions. They argued that Cicero had violated the right of appeal of Roman citizens. That discussion would divide the elite and leave a permanent stain on his name. The Republic had been protected, but the price was high. The idea was established that the state could sacrifice rights in the name of security. In the following months, Cicero wrote and published his speeches to defend his actions. He titled them Orationes in Catilinam and presented them as an example of civic duty. His intention was to fix his version of the facts before history twisted it. Rome, meanwhile, returned to its usual pace, although distrust of the institutions remained latent. Cicero enjoyed unprecedented fame for a time. The Senate granted him the title of Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, an honor that few had received. However, behind the praises lay political instability. Cicero's consulship did not resolve the underlying causes that fueled discontent. debts, poverty and corruption in the provinces. Army veterans demanded rewards, the tribunes of the people demanded more participation, and the aristocrats continued to expand their economic power. Catiline's conspiracy had been suppressed, but the social crisis that caused it remained intact. Cicero, aware of this, tried to position himself as a mediator between the factions, although each attempt increased the rejection of the extremes. In the personal sphere, Cicero remained faithful to the image of the orator who relied on the word as a political tool. His letters reveal a man concerned about the future of Rome and his own place within it. He knew that military power was increasingly imposing itself over civil debate, and that figures like Pompey the Great or Caesar were gaining influence thanks to their armies. The generation that had believed in the Senate as the center of power was beginning to see its authority displaced by generals. That transformation is perceived in Cicero's texts, where the tone changes from confidence to fear. His most brilliant hour was also the beginning of his political decline. Later chroniclers, such as Sallustius Crispus, narrated Catiline's conspiracy as a struggle between virtue and corruption. They presented Cicero as a defender of the state, and Catiline as an example of excessive ambition. However, testimonies show that many Romans saw hope for change in Catiline. His promise to cancel debts and distribute land made him popular among the poor and veterans. The line between revolution and crime was thin, and Cicero crossed it by imposing the authority of the Senate by force. That dilemma, order or justice, would mark all subsequent Roman politics. Every time power felt threatened, leaders recalled the precedent of the year 63 before Christ. The end of that episode did not bring stability. In the year 62 before Christ, the Republican army defeated Catiline in Pistoria, where he died fighting. Cicero was received as a hero, but his influence began to diminish. The allies who had supported him distanced themselves when Caesar and Pompey formed new political alliances. Where the Tiber awoke, the origin of an eternal city. Long before the senators debated in the Roman Forum or the armies paraded under the triumphal arches, the place that would become Rome was nothing more than a swampy area next to the Tiber. In that humid environment, surrounded by low hills, small communities of farmers and shepherds began to settle. There were neither walls nor temples, only mud huts with thatched roofs scattered over the Palatine and the Aventine. That space, where centuries later the imperial palaces would be built, was then marked by dirt paths and streams running down towards the river. The Tiber Valley served as a natural crossing point between the roots of Latium and the Etruscan lands. That geographical position would end up giving Rome a strategic advantage that no other village in the region possessed. The oldest traditions spoke of an origin linked to the descendants of Trojans. Titus Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus recounted that Aeneas, son of Anchises and the goddess Venus, had escaped the destruction of Troy to found a new city in Italy. From that line would come Romulus and Remus, the twins suckled by a she-wolf on the banks of the river. Although the story seems mythical, Mary Beard explains that it formed a central part of the Roman identity, not as a literal history, but as a declaration of destiny. The Romans did not present themselves as just any people, but as heirs of an ancient and destroyed city, called to build a more lasting one. That notion of rebirth was so powerful that it crossed centuries of politics and propaganda. The first archaeological indications place the formation of a stable population nucleus between the 9th century and the 8th century before Christ. The hills surrounding the valley were known as Septimontium, the 7 elevations that would later give the city its name. Each one had its own local rites and deities. A central authority did not yet exist. Cooperation was maintained through family alliances and shared religious ceremonies. The first power structures emerged when these villages decided to organize common festivals to honor Jupiter Latiaris, the protective divinity of Latium. Later history interpreted those encounters as the birth of the Roman state. In reality, they were ways of guaranteeing peace between neighboring groups and ensuring mutual defense against invaders. According to T.J. Cornell's calculations, the population of Rome in the 7th century before Christ might have reached about 10,000 inhabitants. The growth was due to its position as a crossing point between the sea and the interior, and to the influence of the Etruscans from the north, who contributed construction techniques, the alphabet, and religious symbols. The first Roman public works, such as the Cloaca Maxima, were attributed to Etruscan kings. That drainage system transformed the central valley into a habitable zone and allowed for the creation of a civic center where merchants and magistrates would gather. Later, Romans viewed those works as symbols of the first leap from village to city. The traditional account said that Romulus traced the sacred limit of the new city with a plough pulled by an ox and a cow. That strip, called Pomerium, would become a border between the civil and the military. Crossing it with weapons was a profanation. From that division, the space where civil authorities could act and where the jurisdiction of the generals began was defined. The legend of Remus, killed for having jumped over that furrow, reflected the idea that the security of the city was worth more than blood ties. Although modern historians see a later construction in that story, its presence in the sources demonstrates the importance that the Romans gave to sacred borders. During the 8th and 7th centuries before Christ, Rome experienced a gradual evolution. Archaeological records indicate a transition from simple dwellings to rectangular structures with mud walls and tiled roofs. Metallurgy workshops appeared, and exchange routes were established with the Greek colonies in the south. Trade introduced new utensils, fashions, and funerary rituals. The Romans began to adopt insignia of status, such as bronze fibulae and decorated weapons. The cultural mixture was evident, but the people maintained their own identity based on agricultural labor and military service. Beard emphasizes that the earliest Rome was not born through conquest, but through cooperation between families and tribes. The government of the city in the archaic era was monarchic. The sources list 7 kings, although their list is more mythical than documentary. The names of Romulus, Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, and Tarquin the Proud mark distinct stages of social organization. Numa, according to tradition, instituted the worship and religious festivals that ordered the calendar. Tullus promoted military expansion against neighboring cities, and Tarquin represented the Etruscan influence in architecture and royal ceremony. Although we cannot precisely date their reigns, the succession shows how Rome transitioned from an agrarian community to a center with public institutions and state sanctuaries. Each king added a layer of organization that survived his fall. One of the first signs of organized collective life was the creation of a system of clans or gentes. Each extended family had its own name, domestic gods, and burial places. These networks served as the basis for the future Senate, initially composed of the heads of those families. The primitive Senate did not legislate, but acted as the king's council on issues of war and peace. That dual structure, personal authority and collective council, anticipated the republican model. Over time, the patrician clans formed the elite that would control the lands and the priesthood. Meanwhile, the plebeians who constituted the majority worked in the fields and served in the militias. Legends also speak of violent encounters with neighboring peoples. The rape of the Sabines, for example, symbolizes the integration of foreign women into the Roman community. Ancient interpreters did not see the episode as a story of abuse, but as a fusion of tribes through forced alliance. Behind that myth, a common pattern in archaic societies can be recognized, where political and family ties were built through marriages and pacts. Rome thus emerged as a mosaic of diverse origins, in which common identity was created more by custom than by blood. Toward the end of the monarchical era, the city already showed urban features: temples on the hills, markets in the valley, and walls surrounding the central neighborhoods. The wooden bridge over the Tiber, called Pons Sublicius, allowed the traffic of goods between both banks. Coins were not yet common use. Exchanges were made by weight of bronze. That barter economy was combined with a ritualistic religion where every action had its priest and its offering. Roman society was born believing that precision in the rite ensured divine protection. That mentality would persist for centuries in public administration and law. The Oath of Lucretia, the night Rome conquered its freedom. In the heart of the Roman Forum, an ancient stone with an inscription that forever changed the understanding of the origins of Rome was found in 1899. Among the engraved words, one stood out: Resi, a primitive form of rex, meaning for the king. That simple term was enough to confirm that for centuries the city was under a monarchical system. The text, deteriorated and incomplete, was written in an archaic Latin that alternated lines from right to left and vice versa in the bustrophodon style. Experts placed it around the 6th century BC and understood that this stone was direct proof of the existence of kings in early Rome, just as Titus Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus had narrated. According to the chronicles, after Romulus came 6 more monarchs: Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquin the Proud. Each left a distinct mark. Numa organized the religious rites, Tullus expanded military power, Ancus founded the port of Ostia, Priscus promoted the development of the Forum and the Games, Servius instituted the citizen census, and the last one, Tarquin the Proud, ruled harshly until he provoked his expulsion and the birth of the Republic. The reign of the latter ended after an episode of violence, the rape of Lucretia by his son, which triggered the revolt. For generations, Rex became a cursed word in Roman politics. Being accused of aspiring to the title of king was public suicide. The archaeological finding put an end to the doubts of scholars who, in the 19th century, believed that those kings were only literary inventions. The inscription confirmed that some type of royal authority existed, although not in the modern sense of a consolidated monarchy, but as a form of local leadership. Even so, the stories that described these rulers mixed reality and myth. Some details, such as Servius Tullius being born from a sacred flame or Romulus ascending to the heavens, showed how difficult it was to separate history and legend in the foundational accounts. One of the greatest enigmas of this period was the duration assigned to each reign. 7 kings in about 2 centuries and a half would imply governments of more than 30 years, something improbable. It is possible that the Roman monarchy lasted less than the sources indicated, or that there were more kings than were recorded. The archaeological reality shows something different. In the 6th century before Christ, Rome was barely a set of united villages, with about 20,000 to 30,000 inhabitants. There were no massive armies or elaborate foreign policy. The battles narrated by Livy or Dionysius were, probably, brief incursions between neighboring peoples, similar to disputes over territory or livestock. War was a matter for local chiefs and their followers, more like armed gangs than legions. Inscriptions from the era even reveal the existence of private militias, such as that of Publius Valerius, whose sodales, that is, his loyal men, served as personal troops, a reflection of the still tribal Rome. In this context, the title of Rex probably did not mean king as such, but something closer to chief or leader. Power was based on prestige, wealth, and military capacity, rather than institutional authority. Even so, later Romans associated that figure with the founding of their laws, temples, and calendar. In their view, the city was conceived with Romulus, but was formed under the monarchs who followed him. Among them, Numa Pompilius stood out for his peaceful character. He is credited with establishing the foundations of official religion, temples, priesthoods, and festivities. He instituted the Vestal Virgins in charge of the sacred fire and organized the calendar into 12 months, adjusting the lunar cycle by means of an additional month when necessary. The names of the modern months derive from that system. His goal was to harmonize religious and agricultural time. Fertility and harvest rites, such as the Robigalia or the Vinalia, were born in that era. Roman religion did not focus on personal faith, but on practice. The important thing was to fulfill the rituals correctly, because divine favor guaranteed the success of the state. The second great reformer was Servius Tullius, who introduced the census to classify citizens according to their wealth and assign them military duties. From that structure emerged the centuriate assembly, where the vote was organized into groups called centuriae. Although each group had only one vote, the upper classes had more centuriae, which ensured that the rich dominated politics. According to Cicero, that distribution maintained control of power in the hands of the most affluent, under the idea that stability depended on them. This system reflected the social hierarchy that would mark the entire Republican history. The sources also relate the last kings to the Etruscans, the northern peoples who influenced the architecture, art, and rites of Rome. Tarquinius Priscus came from Tarquinia, an Etruscan city, and his wife Tanaquil actively participated in his ascent. It was said that after his assassination, she manipulated the succession to place her protege Servius Tullius on the throne. The latter, in turn, was murdered by Tarquin the Proud, who took power violently. Some thought that this Etruscan connection hid an invasion, But there is no evidence of conquest. Rather, a network of contacts, migrations, and alliances existed between cities in the region. Excavations have found temples of the 6th century before Christ in the area that tradition associates with the sanctuaries of Servius Tullius, as well as vestiges of terracotta statues in the Etruscan style. The artistic and mineral wealth of Etruria left clear traces in young Rome, from bronze to sculpture. The relationships were of exchange rather than submission. In that world of chiefs and gangs, figures like Servius Tullius, called Mastana in the Etruscan tradition, acted as adventurers who moved between territories, leading armed followers. A speech by Emperor Claudius centuries later mentioned that Mastana had arrived in Rome after serving an Etruscan leader, Caelius Vibenna, which would explain the name of the Caelian hill. This account, more military than political, coincided with a painting found in the Francois tomb of Vulci, where the names of Mastana, the Vibenna brothers, and a Tarquin of Rome appear, represented in combat scenes. Those images, dated in the 4th century before Christ, offer a more realistic view of the era: local wars, fragile alliances, and personal struggles for power. Archaeology confirms that by the 6th century before Christ, Rome had already acquired urban features. In the Forum, the floors had been leveled, humid areas drained, and temples and stone dwellings built. The kings sponsored works such as the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus and the Cloaca Maxima, a drainage system that still exists in part. However, tradition remembered these constructions as a symbol of oppression. According to Pliny the Elder, the forced labor in the cloaca was so brutal that some workers committed suicide, and the king ordered their bodies to be exposed as punishment. That combination of technical progress and tyranny was what marked the end of the monarchy. The decisive event came with the tragedy of Lucretia. During the War of Ardea, the king's sons wagered on the virtue of their wives. Upon visiting their homes, they discovered that only Lucretia, wife of Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, fulfilled the expected conduct. Her purity attracted the attention of Prince Sextus Tarquinius, who days later broke into her house and forced her under threat. After confessing what had happened, Lucretia took her own life in front of her husband and Lucius Junius Brutus. The latter took the bloody knife and swore to free Rome from the kings. Thus began the revolt that dethroned Tarquin the Proud and gave rise to the Republic. The moral symbol of Lucretia's sacrifice survived for centuries, and her story became an example of virtue and the origin of Roman freedom. The flight of the Tarquins was not immediate. Lars Porsena, Etruscan king of Clusium, tried to restore them to the throne but was repelled by figures who became legendary: Horatius Coccles, who defended the Tiber Bridge alone, and Cloelia, a hostage who escaped by swimming. Finally, the victory was attributed to the intervention of the gods Castor and Pollux, in whose honor a temple was built in the Forum. With the fall of the monarchy, the Romans defined their identity around a new idea: libertas. From then on, the word rex was associated with despotism, and no later emperor dared to use it. The first consuls, Brutus and Collatinus, assumed shared and limited time power, replacing the kingship with a system of annual election. Their names gave rise to the custom of identifying the years by the consuls in office. In the same period, the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus was consecrated, a symbol of the new regime. The Romans believed that even the Tiber Island had emerged then, formed by the wheat confiscated from the Tarquins. Every element of the city, its temples, its calendar, its topography, was linked to that political birth. The Republic inherited much from the kings: their religious organization, their sense of order, and their institutions. But the Romans conceived it as the triumph of freedom over tyranny. From Livy to Cicero, that word, libertas, resonated as the essence of Rome. The fall of Tarquin the Proud not only marked the end of a dynasty, but the beginning of a model that would influence all of the West. The seed of the law, Rome learns to govern itself. When the monarchy ended, Rome did not immediately transform into a stable republic. For years there was an uncertain stage in which different figures held power with changing titles: praetors, dictators, or tribunes with consular authority. Those first decades were a succession of attempts to establish a lasting political model. The former kings had disappeared, but not their influence. The lists of consuls that were later taken as the official chronology were in part invented reconstructions to give an appearance of continuity to a time still confusing. From that time comes the 12 Tables, drafted around the year 450 before Christ. the oldest legal document in the Roman world. They were an attempt to establish common rules and end the abuses of the nobility. They were written on bronze and publicly displayed so that no one could plead ignorance. The norms dealt with loans, inheritances, contracts, and sanctions. Inequality was explicit. An aggression against a slave was worth half as much as against a citizen. If someone did not pay a debt, they could be sold on the other side of the Tiber. There were curious provisions, such as the obligation to bring a mule if an elderly person had to attend trial, or the prohibition of burying the dead with gold, except for the teeth. That mixture of harshness and practical sense showed the mentality of a peasant society that was beginning to organize itself under the law. The code itself reflected the family structure. The pater familias had power over his house, could adopt, emancipate, or disinherit. The plebeians, without representation in the government, found in these laws a symbol of minimal justice against the patrician authority. However, the tension did not disappear. In the year 494 before Christ, the indebted and oppressed abandoned the city and settled on the Sacred Mount as a sign of protest. It was the first secessio plebis. The crisis gave rise to the tribunate of the plebs, a magistracy created to defend them with veto power over the decisions of the Senate. That did not immediately change the structure of the state, but it opened the door to a long process of negotiation between classes. Over time, inequalities again ignited the conflict. The abuses of the magistrates and the disputes over land culminated in the episode of the Decemvirs, a council of 10 men with extraordinary power. Its main figure, Appius Claudius, tried to appropriate a young woman named Virginia, alleging that she was his slave. Her father killed her to prevent her humiliation, and that act unleashed a revolt that ended with the fall of the council. Since then, the name Claudius remained associated with tyranny, and the people recovered their liberties. The 12 Tables remained consecrated as the moral basis of Roman law. During the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, Rome gradually consolidated its institutions. Agrarian reforms and new laws better distributed the burdens of the state. In the year 367 before Christ, the Licinio-Sextian laws authorized that at least one of the 2 consuls be plebeian. The right to property was recognized, and the size of public lands was limited. In the year 326 before Christ, debt slavery was abolished, one of the most symbolic measures of social balance. The Senate was established as a permanent body formed by former magistrates, while popular assemblies gained decision-making capacity. The struggle between orders was transformed into cooperation, and the political system took the form it would retain for centuries: annual magistrates, popular control, and a lifetime council. At the same time, Rome began to expand outside its immediate territory. In the year 396 before Christ, it defeated Veii, the great Etruscan city located less than 20 kilometers away. The victory doubled the size of the Roman territory and marked the first real step toward the domination of Latium. Shortly after, in the year 390 before Christ, an incursion of Gauls crossed the Tiber and sacked the city. Legend has it that Marcus Furius Camillus directed its reconstruction and ordered a wall of 7 miles to be built, the largest Rome had ever seen. That collective trauma gave rise to an impulse for permanent defense. The Latin wars between the years 341 and 338 before Christ consolidated hegemony over the surrounding peoples. Then began the Samnite campaigns, a series of 3 conflicts between the years 343 and 290 before Christ, which dominated the entire south of the peninsula. In the last one, the Battle of Sentinum, in the year 295 before Christ, pitted Romans, Samnites, Etruscans and Gauls against each other in a decisive battle. Since then, no Italic force could challenge its power. Rome transformed into a military federation that incorporated the defeated through pacts and obligations. The secret of its dominance was the system of alliances. The subjugated peoples did not pay tribute; they contributed soldiers. That formula multiplied the capacity of the army without the need for an expensive administrative apparatus. Some received full civitas romana, others a partial version without a vote, and many were integrated into colonies with Latin rights. For the first time, citizenship ceased to depend on the place of birth. A man could be a citizen of his colony and of Rome at the same time. That political concept was the basis of the later expansion of the empire. As the territory grew, the city also changed. The permanent army generated the need for roads, censuses, and supplies. In the year 312 before Christ, Appius Claudius the Blind ordered the construction of the first great Roman road, the Appian Way, which united the capital with Capua, and the first public aqueduct, the Aqua Appia. Both works transformed the urban infrastructure and symbolized Rome's control over its environment. The organization of roads and supplies was as crucial as military victories. The expansion brought with it a new type of aristocracy. The prominent families no longer depended only on lineage, but on merits obtained in campaign. Virtues came to be measured by military service and public leadership. The city grew to gather near 70,000 inhabitants, an exceptional number for the Western Mediterranean. The houses, temples, and forums multiplied in size. Civil and military power became intertwined, generating a society that valued both military success and political management. Toward the end of the 4th century and the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ, Rome was a dominant power in Italy. The consolidation of the political system coincided with the cultural affirmation of its own identity. The epitaph of Lucius Cornelius Scipio Barbatus, dated around the year 280 before Christ, reflects this. In 4 lines carved in stone, he summarized his life. Son of Gnaeus, brave and prudent, consul, censor, and aedile. He conquered Taurasia and Caesona in Samnium, dominated Lucania, and took hostages. That inscription, the oldest known in classical Latin, showed how the Romans understood glory, public honor, bravery in war, and fidelity to the Republic. The expanding Republic facing the giants. At the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ, Rome was no longer a local power. Its dominance over Latium had consolidated, and the citizen army, supported by the Italic alliances, had turned it into the most stable military force in the Western Mediterranean. From that base, the city began a process of expansion that would take it beyond the peninsula and transform it into a maritime power. The name of the Scipios became synonymous with that new era. From Lucius Cornelius Scipio Barbatus, whose epitaph celebrated campaigns in Samnium and Lucania, to Scipio Aemilianus, destroyer of Carthage, the family symbolized the continuity between the Italic wars and the external conquest. The first great international clash was with Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Hellenistic king who intervened in defense of Tarentum in the year 280 before Christ. His initial victories, achieved with elephants and Macedonian tactics, proved costly. After the so-called Pyrrhic victory, his troops withdrew and Rome secured southern Italy. From then on, the trade routes of the Adriatic and the Tyrrhenian came under Roman influence. That same generation witnessed the beginning of a rivalry that would last more than a century, that of Rome with Carthage. The Punic Wars defined the rise of Rome. In the First War, from the year 264 to 241 before Christ, it faced a superior maritime power. With little naval knowledge, the Romans built an improvised fleet and introduced the corvus, a boarding bridge that transformed naval battle into ground combat. The victory gave them Sicily, their first province. The Second Punic War, between the years 218 and 201 before Christ, was much more devastating. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general, crossed the Alps with an army and with elephants, surprising everyone. At Cannae, in the year 216 before Christ, he annihilated more than 50,000 Romans, a defeat that marked military history. However, the city resisted. The dictator Fabius Maximus adopted the tactic of attrition, avoiding open battles and cutting off the enemy supply. Years later, Publius Cornelius Scipio, called Africanus, took the war to Africa and defeated Hannibal at Zama in the year 202 before Christ. Carthage lost its fleet and was subjugated. The Third Punic War, between the years 149 and 146 before Christ, was a repetition with a tragic end. Scipio Aemilianus, adoptive grandson of the victor of Zama, led the final siege. The city was burned and razed. The survivors were sold as slaves. That same year, the legions also destroyed Corinth, the main Greek center of commerce. The result was the total domination of the Western Mediterranean and Rome's definitive entry into the Hellenistic world. The sea came to be called Mare Nostrum, our sea. After the wars against Carthage came the campaigns in Macedonia and Greece. Between the years 197 and 168 before Christ, Rome successively defeated Philip V and Perseus, kings of Macedonia, and proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks at the Isthmian Games in Corinth. In reality, that freedom meant political dependence. In the year 188 before Christ, it also imposed conditions on Antiochus III of Syria, marking the eastern limits of its influence. The external wars were accompanied by a system of provinces administered by annual governors, generally former consuls or praetors. Sicily, Hispania, and Africa became laboratories of the new imperial government. Contact with the Greek world deeply changed Roman culture. Literature was born from that fusion. Livius Andronicus, a freed slave from Tarentum, translated the Odyssey into Latin in Saturnian verse, creating the first Roman literary work. Afterward came Ennius, who introduced the Greek hexameter, and the playwrights Plautus and Terence, authors of comedies inspired by Attic models. Theatre, previously limited to religious processions, became a public spectacle. In time, the Romans appropriated Hellenic art and education, founding libraries and schools of rhetoric. Polybius, a Greek nobleman taken as a hostage to Rome, was a direct witness to this process. He educated the children of the Scipio family and wrote a universal history that spanned from the year 264 to 146 before Christ. In his books, he explained why Rome had managed to conquer the world because of its mixed constitution. According to him, the consuls represented the monarchy, the Senate the aristocracy, and the people the democracy, three elements that balanced each other. As long as each part fulfilled its function, the system remained stable. That idea of political balance would influence Western theories about power centuries later. Military expansion transformed society. The wealth obtained in campaigns brought booty, slaves, and exotic goods. Triumphs, official processions where generals paraded down the Via Sacra displaying the spoils, became part of the urban calendar. The houses of the nobles were filled with statues, bronzes, and paintings. Thousands of captives worked in the rural villas, and the slave markets multiplied in the port of Delos and in the Roman Forum. Latifundia replaced small farms, changing the economic balance that had sustained the Republic. Contact with the East also introduced new beliefs and foreign divinities. The arrival of the goddess Magna Mater, the Great Mother of Asia Minor, during the Second Punic War, showed how religion accompanied politics. Her cult was brought in the year 204 before Christ by decision of the Senate, following a Sibylline prophecy that promised victory if the goddess arrived in Rome. Her sacred stone, transported by ship from Pessinus, was received with official ceremonies and placed on the Palatine. That mixture of pragmatism and superstition defined the Roman mentality, adopting what was useful without losing state control of the rites. In contrast to that openness, figures like Marcus Porcius Cato Censorius, known as Cato the Elder, defended traditional customs. Cato, censor in the year 184 before Christ, promoted laws against luxury, monitored public morals, and warned about Greek influence. He repeated the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, in the Senate until his death. His attitude reflected the tension between Rome's peasant heritage and the cosmopolitanism acquired through conquest. The new order also gave rise to a cosmopolitan aristocracy. The Scipios, the Aemilii, the Claudii, and the Cornelii accumulated honors and clientele in the provinces. Governors acted with great freedom and complaints of corruption became frequent. However, the system worked because each general sought prestige more than permanent obedience. Rome did not impose a heavy administration. It preferred agreements, treaties, and local alliances. The provinces sent tributes and troops but retained their own laws. That flexible model of dominion allowed Rome to maintain stability in wide territories without excessive bureaucracy. Economically, control of the sea opened new trade routes. Grain from Sicily and Africa fed the population of the capital. Wine and oil from Italy were exported to Hispania and Gaul. Provincial taxes and booty financed temples, roads, and aqueducts. The Via Egnatia, built in Macedonia, linked the Adriatic with the Aegean, facilitating the movement of legions and goods. In the Roman Forum, basilicas replaced the old open-air markets and became centers of business and courts. Culturally, Greek prestige transformed the education of the elites. Young nobles studied in Athens and learned philosophy, rhetoric, and medicine. Scipio Aemilianus gathered writers and thinkers in his house. There, texts by Homer, Polybius, or Panetius of Rhodes were discussed. Contact with the East led Latin to incorporate foreign words and Roman art to adopt Hellenistic models. Marble statues replaced terracotta figures, and temples began to use Doric and Corinthian columns. Rome thus became the cultural heir of Greece, even while dominating it politically. The social consequences of this growth were complex. Many peasants lost their lands by being recruited for long periods of war. Rural villas absorbed small properties and concentrated production in a few hands. In the city, the number of free poor increased. To maintain order, the state began to distribute subsidized grain. That dependence between power and the urban masses became a permanent feature of Roman politics. By the middle of the 2nd century before Christ, Rome was already the undisputed power of the Mediterranean. It had defeated Carthage, Macedonia and Greece, controlled Hispania and Africa, and its influence reached Asia Minor. Roman trade routes, language and laws extended over 3 continents. What had begun as a republic of armed peasants had become an imperial state, supported by professional armies, provincial governors, and a culture that united Latin discipline with Greek refinement. The city beside the Tiber, which a century earlier barely competed with its neighbors, had become the political center of the ancient world. Blood in the Forum, the republic against itself. In the year 146 before Christ, the siege and destruction of Carthage reached levels of brutality unknown even to antiquity. The Romans, led by Scipio Aemilianus, surrounded the city for 2 years until they cut its connection to the sea and starved it into surrender. When the legions broke into the streets, the fighting spread house by house. Soldiers threw enemies from the rooftops, set buildings on fire, and advanced through ruins and corpses. The bones and projectiles found by archaeologists confirm the magnitude of that slaughter. Among the remains, the general ordered the rescue of an agricultural work in 28 volumes written by Mago of Carthage. The Senate commissioned its translation into Latin, convinced that it was a practical treasure for the Roman countryside. Upon contemplating the flames, Aemilianus quoted verses from Homer, aware that Rome was now seen as the heir to the great wars of the past. Months later, Lucius Mummius, consul in Greece, took Corinth. He sacked its temples, deported its inhabitants, and reduced the city to ashes. Later accounts spoke of a fusion of metals so intense that it would have created the mythical Corinthian bronze. Polybius, a witness to the events, described soldiers using Greek paintings as game boards, reflecting the contempt with which they treated the conquered works of art. The wealth seized was distributed among temples and forums in Italy. In Pompeii, an inscription in Oscan was found centuries later, confirming that a statue from Corinth had been donated by Lucius Mummius, consul. That year, Rome eliminated its 2 great rivals and completely dominated the Mediterranean. But that victory also marked the beginning of internal decay. Sallust, writing decades later, maintained that the fall of Carthage broke the moral balance. Without external enemies, the state sank into ambition and corruption. The concentration of power and wealth accelerated, and the armies, formerly defenders of the people, began to serve personal interests. In the year 137 before Christ, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, grandson of Scipio Africanus, travelled through Etruria on his way to Hispania. He observed fields worked by foreign slaves while free peasants disappeared. Upon his return, he was elected tribune of the people and proposed a law to redistribute the public lands that the rich had occupied. The limit would be 500 jugera per family, and the rest would be distributed among the poor. His proposal generated a political clash. A rival tribune, Marcus Octavius, tried to veto it, but Tiberius managed to remove him by popular vote, and the law was approved. A commission of 3 members, himself, his brother Gaius, and his father-in-law, was created to implement the distribution. The Senate, dominated by large landowners, refused to finance the project. Tiberius then resorted to the inheritance of King Attalus III of Pergamum, who had left his kingdom to the Roman people. With those funds, measurements, allotments, and agricultural implements were financed. Tensions increased when he was accused of wanting to establish a monarchy and seek immediate re-election. During the voting on the capital, a group of senators led by his cousin Scipio Nasica burst in with improvised weapons and beat him to death. The bodies of Tiberius and his followers were thrown into the Tiber. The episode inaugurated a long era of political violence. In the year 123 before Christ, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, resumed his cause. He was elected tribune for 2 consecutive years and promoted a series of far-reaching laws. Among them, he established that the state would sell grain monthly at a reduced price to citizens, creating a permanent supply system. Warehouses were built and intermediaries were hired for their distribution. Rome thus became the first ancient city that guaranteed food to its population using public funds. Furthermore, Gaius expanded colonization, promoted settlements inside and outside Italy, attempted to extend citizenship to Italic allies, and regulated the abuses of provincial governors. During his speeches, he broke a symbolic tradition. He spoke with his back to the Senate, looking directly at the crowd gathered in the forum. In the year 121 before Christ, upon trying to stop the annulment of his laws, he confronted the consul Lucius Opimius, who gathered militias and pursued him. He died in the clashes or took his own life. Thousands of his followers were executed. To justify the repression, the Senate approved an extraordinary decree that gave the consuls authority to protect the state. It was the first precedent for emergency powers used later to eliminate political adversaries. Meanwhile, tensions between Rome and its Italian allies grew. Many local leaders, although economically integrated, still lacked access to full citizenship. The abuses of Roman magistrates, such as the case of the mayor of Tianum, whipped by order of a Roman lady, ignited resentment. Some towns, like Fregellae, tried to rebel and were destroyed. In the year 91 before Christ, after the assassination of the tribune Marcus Livius Drusus, the social war broke out. Allied cities formed a league called Italia, with its capital in Corfinium. They minted coins with the image of a bull wounding a she-wolf, a symbol of resistance against Rome, and fought for 2 years. The conflict was bloody. The Romans lost tens of thousands of men, and the walls of Pompeii still bear marks of the siege. To end the war, Rome offered citizenship to those who laid down their arms. In the year 89 before Christ, most of Italy was incorporated into the Roman civic body. The number of citizens tripled, and the state became a national community. However, the political system did not adapt to this new magnitude. Voting continued to take place only in the capital, and many newly integrated Italics could not exercise their rights due to distance or lack of means. In this context, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, commander in the war against the Allies, emerged. In the year 88 before Christ, he marched on Rome at the head of his legions, demanding that he be returned command of the campaign against Mithridates VI of Pontus. It was the first time since Coriolanus that a general used his army against the city itself. After winning in the east, he returned in the year 83 before Christ and repeated the invasion. During the fighting, the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitol, a symbol of the Republic, burned down. Sulla imposed terror through the so-called proscriptions, lists of public enemies whose executions were rewarded. Hundreds of senators and thousands of citizens were murdered and their assets confiscated. It was the first systematic regime of political purges in Rome. In the year 82 before Christ, he proclaimed himself dictator to reorganize the Republic. His mandate, without a time limit, allowed him to rewrite laws and offices. Doubling the number of senators to 600, he established that any quaestor automatically became part of the Senate. He increased the number of minor magistrates, set minimum ages for each office, and prohibited repeating them in less than 10 years. He presented these measures as a return to ancient customs, although in reality they consolidated a personal control of power. He reduced the powers of the tribunes of the people, annulled their ability to introduce laws, and closed the path to other offices in order to neutralize future reformers. His program also included the temporary suspension of grain distribution and a restructuring of public trials. By discharging his veterans, he settled them on lands of rebellious communities, displacing local inhabitants and creating tensions that would last decades. Many of these impoverished soldiers would later join the movement of Catiline in the year 63 before Christ. Sulla resigned in the year 79 before Christ and retired to Campania, where he died shortly after. He had demonstrated that a general with his own army could impose his will on the state. Rome thus experienced the first personal dictatorship in its history, a direct precedent for that of Caesar. A few years later, an unexpected revolt tested Roman authority. In the year 73 before Christ, a group of gladiators led by Spartacus escaped from the school in Capua and attracted thousands of slaves and discontented peasants. For almost 2 years, they repeatedly defeated the legions sent against them. In the year 71 before Christ, they were annihilated by Crassus's troops, and 6,000 prisoners were crucified along the Appian Way. Even so, the rebellion made clear the internal deterioration of the system. Armies formed to conquer the world were incapable of maintaining order in Italy. The first century before Christ closed with a Rome powerful externally and broken internally. The institutions that had arisen in a city of peasants could no longer control an empire. The armies depended more on their generals than on the Republic, and violence became part of everyday politics. The Gracchi's attempt to repair inequality, the war with the Allies, Sulla's dictatorship and Spartacus's rebellion were symptoms of the same transformation. The transition from a republic of citizens to a state dominated by military strongmen. The balance that had sustained Rome for centuries slowly crumbled, while the city prepared for a new type of power. From Pompey to Augustus, the era of the victors. A mid-century of the first before Christ, Rome was an enormous state sustained by armies loyal to their commanders rather than to the institutions. The conquests of Asia, Hispania and Africa had filled the temples with spoils and the senators with clientele, but they had also fractured the balance that maintained the Republic. Internal wars became inevitable. In that scenario, 3 figures emerged who would mark the end of the old Rome: Pompey, Caesar, and Octavian. Gnaeus Pompey. Magnus gained prestige by defeating the pirates in the Mediterranean and Mithridates of Pontus. In the year 66 before Christ, he received exceptional power to clear the sea of privateers in just 3 months. He divided the area into sectors, coordinated simultaneous squadrons, and achieved what decades of consuls had failed to do. Afterward, in the east, he reorganized provinces, founded cities, and established allied kingdoms. He returned to Rome with a triumphal parade that lasted 2 days, showcasing captives and the treasures of Asia. With his campaigns, the map of the empire was expanded to Syria and Judea, and trade with the east reached an unprecedented level. Meanwhile, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, sought political power. He financed campaigns and public buildings to gain influence. However, his position remained overshadowed by Pompey's glory. Both needed political support, and their union with Gaius Julius Caesar sealed an informal pact later known as the First Triumvirate. Caesar, who had been aedile and praetor, brought charisma, political talent, and the backing of the urban plebs. The agreement guaranteed them control of the Senate and the elections. In the year 59 before Christ, Caesar was elected consul. He promoted an agrarian law that assigned land to Pompey's veterans and the poor citizens. The Senate opposed it, but the law was approved in public assembly. After his term, he obtained the governorship of the Gauls for 5 years, which was later extended to 10. From there, he began a series of campaigns that transformed the northern frontier. Between the years 58 and 50 before Christ, he subdued the Gallic tribes, crossed the Rhine, and landed in Britannia. In his commentaries on the Gallic War, written in the third person, he narrated these victories with military precision. The reports showed a disciplined army and a commander who acted with decisiveness. The spoils and tributes enriched Rome and reinforced his popularity. In Rome, the triumvirate alliance began to crumble. Crassus died in the year 53 before Christ during a disastrous campaign in Carrhae against the Parthians, where his army was annihilated and the legionary eagles captured. At the same time, Pompey's wife, Julia, Caesar's daughter, died, breaking the family bond that maintained peace between the two. The Senate, fearful of Caesar's growing power, supported Pompey and named him sole consul. Caesar was ordered to disband his army and return as a private citizen. The 10th of January of the year 49 before Christ, Caesar crossed the Rubicon with the 13th Legion. It was a symbolic border. By doing so, he declared war on the Senate. The phrase, "the die is cast," became linked to that moment. Pompey and many senators fled to Greece. In the civil war that followed, Caesar advanced rapidly. He took Rome without resistance, controlled Hispania after the victory at Ilerda, and defeated Pompey at Pharsalus in the year 48 before Christ. The general fled to Egypt, where he was murdered by order of the young king Ptolemy XIII. When Caesar arrived, he received his rival's head wrapped in cloth. His reaction was one of disgust. He ordered the culprits punished and supported Cleopatra VII on the throne. During his stay in Alexandria, Caesar reorganized the Egyptian administration and maintained a personal relationship with the queen. Back in Rome, in the year 46 before Christ, he celebrated 4 consecutive triumphs for his campaigns in Gaul, Egypt, Africa, and Asia. As he passed, the crowds cheered him. However, the honors the Senate granted him began to seem excessive: golden statues, permanent laurel crowns, and a seat among the state gods. In the year 44 before Christ, he assumed the title of dictator in perpetuity. The 15th of March of that same year, he was assassinated during a Senate session. The conspirators, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, stabbed him 23 times next to the statue of Pompey. His body lay at the foot of the Curia Pompeia. The next day, during the public funeral, Mark Antony read his will and showed his bloody cloak to the crowd. The people, outraged, set fire to the assassins' houses and erected an altar in his honor in the Roman Forum. The responsible senators fled or were pursued. After his death, power fragmented again. In the will, Caesar adopted Gaius Octavius, an 18-year-old young man who was in Illyria, as his son and heir. Upon returning to Italy, he presented himself as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus and demanded the fulfillment of the inheritance. Although the Senate underestimated him, he soon demonstrated political skill. He temporarily allied with Mark Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, forming the Second Triumvirate, legalized in the year 43 before Christ by a special law that granted them authority to restore the Republic. In reality, it meant absolute control of the state. The triumvirs initiated massive proscriptions to finance their armies and eliminate enemies. Among the victims was Cicero, executed in December of the year 43 before Christ. His head and hands were displayed on the rostrum where he had delivered his speeches. His death symbolized the end of republican political freedom. The provinces were divided among the 3. Antony received the east, Lepidus Africa, and Octavian the west. The alliance, however, did not last long. Tensions between Antony and Octavian increased when the former established himself in Alexandria with Cleopatra. In the year 31 before Christ, the fleets of the two faced each other in the Battle of Actium on the Greek coast. Octavian's victory was decisive. Antony and Cleopatra took refuge in Egypt and, finding themselves surrounded, ended their lives. With their disappearance, the last significant resistance was extinguished. Octavian returned to Rome with total control of the legions and the treasury. In the year 27 before Christ, he formally returned his powers to the Senate, which, in gratitude, granted him the title of Augustus. Thus was born the Principate, a regime that retained the republican forms but concentrated authority in one single person. Between thermal baths and temples, the heart of the empire. Under the government of Augustus, Rome ceased to be a city saturated with ruins and shacks to become a monumental center. The emperor himself said he had received a city of brick and delivered one of marble. The streets were widened, the temples were restored, and forums, aqueducts, and public baths were built. The works were not only decorative, they offered work to thousands of workers and conveyed an image of order after decades of war. The imperial power was shown as a protector of urban life. The city was home to more than 1 million people. The popular neighborhoods, formed by multi-story insulae, were crowded next to taverns, workshops, and markets. Many constructions were made of wood, with narrow stairs and no smoke outlet, which is why fires were frequent. Residents of the upper floors were usually artisans or recently arrived migrants. In contrast, patrician homes, the domus, occupied wide spaces around the central atrium, decorated with mosaics, statues, and frescoes. In Pompeii, these murals preserve mythological scenes, family portraits, and imaginary landscapes that allow us to know the taste of the Roman elite. The water supply was a symbol of civic prestige. Aqueducts like the Aqua Marcia or the Aqua Claudia transported flows from tens of kilometers to the public fountains. The hydraulic network fed baths, thermal springs, and domestic fountains. The Curatores Aquarum, officials responsible for the system, watched over its maintenance and illegal connections. Water reached everyone, although with privileges. Noble residences had private pipes, while the majority depended on communal fountains. Public baths were an essential point of daily life. There were complexes such as those of Agrippa, Nero, or Caracalla, which brought together temperate pools, gyms, and libraries. They were spaces for social coexistence and also for propaganda. The imperial thermal baths showed the splendor of the administration. Admission tickets were cheap and women had separate hours. The excavations of Herculaneum preserve rooms with intact mosaics, where the names of the slaves in charge of heating the water in underground furnaces can still be read. The system of slavery sustained a good part of the urban work. In the cities, slaves acted as secretaries, cooks, hairdressers, architects, or accountants. In patrician houses there were internal hierarchies, those born there, those bought, and the freedmen, former servants freed by their owners. Many freedmen prospered as artisans or merchants, and in time their descendants came to hold municipal offices. The inscriptions found in tombs show the pride of these new citizens for having achieved freedom and prosperity. Urban commerce revolved around the markets and the ports of the Tiber. The Portus Ostiae, enlarged by Claudius and Trajan, received wheat from Egypt and Africa. The state ensured its distribution through the annona, a system that delivered monthly rations to those listed in the census. The warehouses and mills worked without pause to cover the demand. The ships that transported the grain bore the emperor's insignia and in some cases belonged to private companies associated with the state. Daily life was marked by spectacles. The Circus Maximus, with a capacity for more than 150,000 people, hosted chariot races organized by teams of colors, blues, greens, reds and whites, that aroused passions comparable to those of modern sports clubs. Gladiators fought in amphitheaters throughout the empire, although the Colosseum remained the central stage. There, under Titus or Domitian, games that lasted several days were celebrated. The arena was covered with yellow dust, mobile decorations were erected, and the combats alternated with hunts of exotic animals. Tickets were free and served to reinforce the image of the emperor as a provider of entertainment and justice. The state used spectacles to maintain popular loyalty. Emperors offered bread and entertainment in exchange for stability. Food distributions and festivals coincided with dynastic anniversaries or military victories. The minted coins showed these celebrations along with slogans about prosperity and concord. The control of urban opinion depended more on these festivals than on force. Religion was intertwined with politics. Each emperor held the office of Pontifex Maximus, head of the state cult. Temples functioned as religious and administrative centers. Records, contracts, and treasures were kept in them. The priestesses of Vesta maintained the sacred fire of the state, a symbol of Rome's permanence. Public sacrifices recalled the hierarchy between gods and men. The magistrate recited prayers, the herald announced the rite, and a slave held the animal before the sacrifice. Festivals like the Saturnalia or the Lupercalia combined ancient rituals with popular celebrations that paralyzed daily life. The multiplicity of cults coexisted without apparent conflict. Along with the ancient Italic deities, the Romans adopted foreign gods, Isis of Egypt, Mithras of Persia, and Cybele of Phrygia. Each had its own temples, priests, and processions. The rise of these personal cults reflected the diversity of the empire. In workshops, taverns, and homes, small domestic altars, the lares and penates, protected the family. The walls of Pompeii preserve inscriptions dedicated to minor divinities, with simple phrases of gratitude or supplication. The imperial administration regulated all aspects of the city. Each neighborhood had local chiefs, the Vico Magistri, responsible for order and celebrations. The aediles supervised markets, prices, weights, and public cleanliness. Fires, a constant threat, were fought with fire departments recruited from freedmen. Night patrols monitored compliance with regulations and the security of grain warehouses. Roman bureaucracy functioned with precise hierarchies and official seals engraved on wax or bronze tablets. Urbanism reflected social inequalities. The neighborhoods of the Palatine and the Esquiline housed palaces, while the Subura concentrated dense and humble housing. The streets paved with basalt slabs had raised sidewalks and stones to cross during the rains. Public fountains and votive statues were installed at the intersections. Traffic was restricted during the day, except for service or construction carts. Taverns, bakeries, and workshops occupied the ground floors, generating a constant noise that filled the neighborhood. The family was the nucleus of society. The pater familias had legal authority over all members, including slaves and freedmen. Marriage was a civil contract, and upper-class women participated in ceremonies, inheritances, and businesses. Many managed properties and financed public buildings. Inscriptions on walls and monuments preserve names of benefactresses who paid for temples or fountains in memory of their relatives. Epitaphs reveal a language of affection and respect, reflecting personal bonds beyond the law. Inside the houses, family altars and portraits of ancestors recalled the continuity of the lineage. Every domestic festivity included offerings of wine and bread. Slaves and freedmen participated in these rites, reinforcing the idea of community under the same roof. The home was not just a private space, but an extension of public order. Civic virtues and obedience to the state were taught there. Overall, life within the empire showed a mixture of discipline, spectacle, and religion. Rome maintained the appearance of citizen freedom, but the imperial structure regulated even the smallest details of urban existence. From the aqueducts to the amphitheaters, everything served to project stability. The ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved under the ash, remain the best photograph of that balance between power and daily life that defined Roman civilization. The power in inheritance, the age of the Caesars. When Octavian returned to Rome after the civil wars, he did so as the absolute victor. The Senate, eager for stability, granted him the title of Augustus, an unprecedented name that conveyed respect and religious authority. From then on, Caesar's young heir left behind his image as a strong man to become the figure who would give definitive shape to imperial power. His ascent was not the result of a premeditated plan, but of years of improvisation, pacts, adjustments, and a constant ability to present every measure as a continuity of the Republic. His personal transformation was as profound as that of the state. The impetuous young man of the proscriptions became a cautious ruler, capable of balancing authority and the appearance of legality. The old republican magistracies continued to exist, but the real power was concentrated in his hands. The Senate voted on his decisions, and the population revered him as a protector. In the year 8 before Christ, the month Sextilis was renamed August in his honor, fixing his name in the calendar. Augustus presented himself as the heir of the founders of Rome. His new forum displayed statues of Romulus, Aeneas, and Republican heroes next to his own, in the center, mounted on a triumphal chariot. It was a clear message. All of Roman history culminated in him. At the same time, he controlled visual propaganda through hundreds of portraits distributed throughout the empire. On coins, sculptures, and gems, his eternally young face was repeated, even though in reality he had wrinkles and was short in stature. That ideal image became a model for all subsequent emperors. The reorganization of the army was one of his most lasting works. He fixed a regular service of 20 years and guaranteed state-paid pensions, eliminating the personal link between soldiers and generals that had caused the civil wars. From then on, the legions obeyed the emperor, not individuals. Only a few troops remained in Rome, while the bulk of the army was distributed along the Rhine, the Danube, and the Euphrates. Thus was born the first permanent army of the Western world. In internal politics, Augustus concentrated the functions of the Senate and the assemblies. Popular elections became a formalism, while offices were granted by imperial recommendation. For the senators, the change brought privileges and limits, hereditary rank, preferential seats in spectacles, and prohibition from engaging in commerce or theatre. The ancient competition between powerful families was transformed into courtly service. The triumph, the maximum symbol of republican glory, was reserved for the emperor and his family. The last common general to parade through Rome did so in the year 19 before Christ. Afterwards, that honor was exclusive to the throne. Even so, the administration still needed the Senate. The governors, judges, and high officials came from its body, which maintained the illusion of institutional continuity. Senatorial decrees retained the force of law, but within the framework imposed by the prince. The new system was sustained by balance. The emperor ensured stability and prosperity, the senators received dignity, and the people bread and spectacles. His example inspired later emperors. Claudius sought to imitate him with the conquest of Britannia. Trajan erected his column to commemorate the Danube Wars. Hadrian left the Pantheon, whose dome is still one of the largest in the world. All inherited the formula of Augustus: expand the territory, distribute wealth, and leave a mark in stone. However, beneath the apparent calm, tensions existed. In the year 9 after Christ, 3 legions were annihilated in the forests of Germania, a blow that marked the northern limit of the expansion. In Rome, several plots threatened imperial security. Some nobles resented the loss of autonomy. Others, like Marcus Ignatius Rufus, tried to stand out without the prince's permission and paid with their lives. Conspiracies were punished without mercy, and censorship silenced critics. Poets like Ovid ended up exiled for challenging the moral norms imposed from the palace. The imperial court became the new center of power. The influence of Livia, Augustus's wife, grew over time. Her role, although without a formal title, was key in domestic and succession decisions. Family intrigues revolved around who would inherit the command. Augustus prepared several male relatives, but the death of many candidates forced him to successive adjustments until Tiberius, Livia's son, remained as the only viable heir. When the founder died in the year 14 after Christ, Rome no longer conceived of any other form of government than that of a single man. Tiberius maintained the structure created by his predecessor. He governed from a distance with prudence and distrust, supported by the prefect Sejanus and the inherited bureaucratic apparatus. Under his mandate, the Senate lost even more initiative, and political fear grew. Upon his death, power passed to Caligula, Augustus's young grandson, whose eccentric and brutal behavior scandalized even his contemporaries. He was succeeded by Claudius, a scholar and withdrawn man, who expanded the imperial administration to new provinces and reinforced citizenship outside of Italy. During these first emperors, often called the Julio-Claudians until Caracalla, the empire experienced a silent transformation. Borders stabilized, provinces adopted local government structures, and the population began to feel part of a common community. Mediterranean cities copied the Roman models: forums, thermal baths, theaters, and temples similar to those in the capital. Latin and Greek spread as administrative and cultural languages. The imperial economy depended on inequality. Large rural properties dominated agricultural production, while slaves and free peasants worked the land. Senatorial and equestrian fortunes grew thanks to provincial taxes and maritime trade. At the same time, social mobility increased. Freedmen, former slaves, reached management positions, and retired soldiers formed colonies that Romanized entire regions. In that hierarchical world, citizenship was a valuable privilege that granted access to Roman law and the emperor's protection. With the passage of time, the condition of citizen was expanded. Claudius granted rights to Gallic communities. Vespasian extended them to Hispano-Romans and Africans. In the year 212 after Christ, the emperor Caracalla promulgated the Edict of Antoninus, which granted citizenship to all free men of the empire. That decision culminated the process begun by Augustus. Rome was no longer just an Italian city, but an immense network of peoples united by law, language, and imperial cult. In the provinces, local elites imitated the models of the capital. Cities erected temples dedicated to Rome and the emperor, organized games in his honor, and sent embassies to the Senate. Integration was not only political but also cultural. Mosaics, sculptures, and portraits found from Britannia to Syria repeat the styles of the capital. Power was expressed in the architecture and in the image of the prince, present even in the most remote corners of the empire. The official religion coexisted with a wide diversity of cults. The temples of Isis, Mithras, and Cybele attracted devotees throughout the Mediterranean. Domestic rites dedicated to the Lares and Penates continued to mark family life. At the same time, the cult of the emperor unified the feeling of belonging. Celebrating his health and fortune was a form of civic loyalty. In cities like Ephesus or Merida, imperial altars became the center of public ceremonies. Towards the beginning of the 3rd century after Christ, Rome had been transformed into a civilization spread across 3 continents. Imperial roads united Hispania, Africa, and Asia. Ships crossed the Mediterranean transporting grain, wine, and oil. The legions guarded distant borders, while urban life prospered with theaters, thermal baths, and forums where citizens spoke of laws, taxes, and spectacles. Thus, the inheritance of Augustus had forever changed the meaning of Rome. What began as the domination of a single man became a system that absorbed peoples, languages, and cultures under a single framework. From the marble of the Palatine to the ruins of Palmyra, the entire Roman world shared the same idea: that of an empire turned into a common home. The end of Roman power from Caracalla to Constantinople. After the death of Caracalla, imperial power was left in the hands of officers who contested the command. The throne passed from one garrison to another, and each general proclaimed himself the legitimate heir. During the following decades, Rome lost the stability that had characterized the previous century. The provinces, formerly sources of wealth and soldiers, became scenes of riots and looting. In the fields, production fell, and the roads ceased to be safe. The effective control of the empire was reduced to what the legions could defend with their immediate strength. Between the years 235 and 284 after Christ, more than 20 men occupied the throne, almost all of military origin. Some lasted weeks, others barely days. The loyalty of the army was bought with money, and the soldiers assassinated anyone who did not fulfill their promises. Gold was no longer enough. Silver reserves were exhausted, the currency lost value, and trade was paralyzed. Taxes increased until they ruined the cities. In the north, the Germans crossed the Rhine, while in the east, the Persians, reorganized by the Sasanian dynasty, threatened Syria and Mesopotamia. Gibbon describes this time as a cycle of continuous wars, where the empire survived by inertia, sustained by custom rather than government. Insecurity even reached the temples and sanctuaries. In Rome, the old rituals continued to be practiced, but without faith or grandeur. In the provinces, local administrators abandoned their posts, unable to collect taxes or impose order. Many citizens sought refuge in rural villas, fortified like small fortresses. The countryside once again occupied the central role it had lost centuries ago. In the void of authority, ephemeral kingdoms arose. In Gaul, Postumus gathered troops and ruled as a local emperor. In the east, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra extended her power to Egypt and challenged the Senate. The chaos was partially contained by Aurelian, who recovered Palmyra and reorganized the borders. Under his command, an appearance of unity was restored, although only for a short time. His assassination returned power to the barracks, and it was Diocletian who, in the year 284 after Christ, took command and ended the military anarchy. He understood that no one man could control such a vast territory and created a new formula, the Tetrarchy. The empire was divided into two main zones, each led by an Augustus assisted by a Caesar. This structure was intended to ensure succession and balance. Diocletian transformed the administration with a hierarchical network of governors and officials. The provinces were divided into smaller units, easier to supervise. Taxes were fixed according to regular censuses and were paid with products or labor. Cities lost autonomy and public offices became hereditary obligations. Civil life was regulated down to the details. Gibbon points out that this bureaucratic rigidity preserved order at the expense of freedom. To reinforce discipline, the army was professionalized again, with permanent garrisons in the critical points of the territory. The emperor adopted an almost divine figure. Imperial ceremonies imitated the Eastern courts. No one approached without bowing, and the purple clothing became an exclusive symbol of sovereignty. In that same period, a systematic persecution against Christians was unleashed. Diocletian ordered the destruction of temples, the burning of sacred texts, and the imprisonment of those who refused to offer sacrifices to the gods of the state. But the repression failed to eliminate that faith, which continued to expand in secret and strengthen its organization. When Diocletian abdicated, his successors clashed for control. From that struggle emerged a new protagonist, Constantine. His ascent culminated in the Battle of Milvian Bridge in the year 312 after Christ, where, according to chroniclers, he marched under a Christian symbol. After his victory, he decreed religious freedom through the Edict of Milan and restituted property to the Church. His government merged Roman authority with Christian values, establishing a new ideological balance. Constantine moved the center of power to the east and founded a new capital over the ancient Byzantium. He named it Constantinople and filled it with forums, temples, and walls. Its position between Europe and Asia gave it strategic and commercial advantages. From there, he reorganized the laws, strengthened the army, and reinforced the link between the monarchy and religion. In the year 325 after Christ, he convened the Council of Nicaea, where the official doctrine of the Church was defined and an attempt was made to unify beliefs under a single faith. his reign consolidated the transition from a pagan empire to a Christian one. Upon his death, in the year 337 after Christ, the empire fragmented again among his sons. The 4th century was marked by the coexistence of two worlds, the Roman tradition and expanding Christianity. Ancient temples were transformed into churches, religious processions replaced sacrifices, and imperial figures began to be considered chosen by divine will. In the year 380 after Christ, the Emperor Theodosius declared Christianity the official religion through the Edict of Thessalonica, prohibiting pagan cults. Since then, political and religious power advanced together. After the death of Theodosius, the empire was permanently divided. Arcadius governed in the east and Honorius in the west. The first inherited the richest provinces, the second the most vulnerable. The migrations of peoples displaced by the Huns pushed Germans, Goths and Vandals toward the Roman borders. The legions, insufficient and poorly paid, barely resisted the attacks. In the year 410 after Christ, the Visigoths led by Alaric took Rome. It was the first time in 8 centuries that the city had fallen to a foreign army. Gibbon pointed to this fact as a devastating moral blow. The symbol of the ancient world had been violated. Meanwhile, the East remained intact. Constantinople, protected by its walls and its maritime position, became the nucleus of a new civilization. Greek replaced Latin as the official language, and Orthodox Christianity marked the Byzantine identity. Under Justinian, who governed between the years 527 and 565 after Christ, Byzantium reached its peak. His generals Belisarius and Narses recovered territories in Italy, Africa, and part of Hispania. Justinian ordered the compilation of Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis, the basis of subsequent European laws. He also ordered the construction of Hagia Sophia, whose dome dominated the capital's horizon. The splendor of his reign did not last. Continuous wars and epidemics exhausted the economy. After Justinian, the Eastern Empire was reduced to a defensive power. In the 7th century, the Islamic conquests seized Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. The Byzantines resisted in Asia Minor and preserved their capital thanks to the strength of its walls and the use of the so-called Greek fire. Even weakened, the empire continued to be a center of culture, commerce, and religion. During the following centuries, Byzantium faced internal and external conflicts. Disputes over sacred images divided society and pitted the clergy against imperial power. In the year 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Western troops occupied Constantinople and plundered it. Although the Byzantines recovered the city in the year 1261, their strength never returned to the same level. The economy collapsed, and the provinces became independent one after another. The end came in the year 1453. Ottoman troops, led by Mehmed II, surrounded Constantinople and bombarded it for weeks. The last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, fought in person and died defending the walls. On the 29th of May, the Turks entered the city, the imperial standard fell, and with it, the last political inheritance of Rome was extinguished. However, its laws, language, and faith survived in Europe for centuries. Thus ended the history of the greatest empire of antiquity, which had dominated the world for more than 1,000 years. Its disappearance did not erase its legacy. The organization of power, the roots, the architecture, and the Roman ideas continued to shape the continent that emerged afterward.